I want to thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't already know it, you're going to discover that there is no law requiring anybody to pay income taxes or keep books and records for income tax purposes. And you'll also discover that there is no penalties or crimes involving income taxes. Despite this, as reported in the paper, because of IRS pressure, people have committed suicide. As a matter of fact, if you saw the Maury Povich show last year, well, husband committed suicide. People have had nervous breakdowns, forced into bankruptcy, and their businesses literally destroyed, all because of IRS pressure. And all because they were pressured to pay a tax that no law requires anybody to pay. Here is the Internal Revenue Code, and I'm the nation's leading seller of Internal Revenue Code. I buy them 500 at a clip. We're going to get into this. And there is no law in here that requires anybody to keep books and records or to pay income taxes. Now, I just said a little while ago, because of IRS pressure. Now, the government, the federal government, has done a terrific public relations job. They've gotten everybody to hate the IRS and fear the IRS, while presumably still respecting and liking their government. It's amazing. On the Maury Povich show, for instance, and these other shows, they'll talk about IRS abusing their authority, the IRS doing this, the IRS doing that. Nobody ever bothers to mention it's the government that's doing it. It would be as if I were walking around a room punching people in the nose. And the people would say, oh, Schiff is a nice guy, but his fist, oh, his fist is terrible. As if I have no control over my fist. This is what the government has done. But the IRS does nothing that the courts and Congress doesn't let them get away with. The real culprits here are federal judges who have been putting people in jail, knowingly putting people in jail, for violating a law that nobody was required to obey. As a matter of fact, there's no law. As a matter of fact, the definition of a tax is a mandatory exaction for the support of government. Since there's nothing mandatory in here about paying an income tax, it shouldn't even be called an income tax. The government invites contributions. As a matter of fact, when I write certain articles or pleadings to the court, sometimes I take the word tax and I put quotes around it, because technically there is no such thing as an income tax. There is no such thing as a voluntary tax. Either you're required to pay it, in which case it's a law, and if you're not required to pay it, it shouldn't even be termed a tax. And you know, it's strange. The government reports from time to time when there's a tornado or the flood or a hurricane and people's houses are damaged and destroyed. The government immediately jumps in with low income loans, low interest rate loans, and we're going to help these people. At the same time, every day, hundreds of houses are being seized by the IRS or the government. Paychecks, bank accounts, where people lose their homes because they don't have their bank accounts. As a matter of fact, in the March 1997 issue of the Reader's Digest, there was an article, The IRS versus Us, meaning U.S. And in that article, they accurately reported that in 1996, the IRS seized 3 million paychecks. So here's the government seizes homes from some people in order to get money so these people can fix up their home. Now, the reason they do that is they get a lot of publicity when they fix up people's homes. It seems like we have a benevolent government. Meanwhile, the papers don't report the homes in the given community that the IRS seizes. So the whole thing is nonsense. So the newspapers don't report it. In a nutshell, the IRS, the income tax, represents the greatest program of organized extortion the world has ever seen. How is it possible, therefore, you might ask, how is the government able to hoodwink 100 million Americans into paying a tax that no law requires anybody to pay? Well, the government has a lot of help. It has a lot of help from the people, the tax preparers, who the public looks to for tax advice. Your accountants, your tax lawyers, the publishing companies who publish all kinds of books on, paying the income tax. They know it's voluntary. They know there is no statute requiring you to pay. But the real beneficiaries of the income tax are the American Bar Association. They make billions of dollars litigating a law that that doesn't even exist. Make billions of dollars. And I can't conceive of a tax lawyer not knowing what I'm going to tell you today. But before we get through, I can assure you that you will know more about income tax than 95% of the accountants and the lawyers who hold themselves off as being experts. Now, the fact of the matter is that you came down here today is really unnecessary. Everybody should have known all there is to know about the income tax if they just paid 50 cents and they bought the January 9th issue of the San Diego Union Tribune. And for 50 cents, you would have learned, here's a book I wrote, The Federal Mafia. It's $30. Nobody should have to pay $30 to buy this book because they would find out everything they needed from this little article in the San Diego Union Tribune. And what happened is that on January 8th, the former commissioner, Margaret Milner Richardson, resigned. She resigned the day before. Let me read the account that appeared in the San Diego Union Tribune. IRS Commissioner Margaret Milner Richardson warned yesterday that continued public bashing of her agency may someday undermine Americans' willingness to pay their taxes voluntarily. Ultimately, she said, I worry it may have some impact on our self-assessment system. Now, there's two things she said. The payment of income tax is voluntary, and she mentioned self-assessment. Now, how many people, when they read this, said, gee, she's the commissioner. She's saying it's voluntary. I won't volunteer anymore. No, you know what they would assume? They would assume she made a mistake. Now, most Americans are, when it comes to income taxes, they have the psychological ailment. It's called cognitive dissonance, which is a psychological ailment which says that if you have a deep-seated belief of something and somebody tells you something that's contrary to that deep-seated belief, you reject it. You don't even consider it. It's like throwing a ping pong ball against your head. So many Americans believe that they're required to pay income taxes that even when the commissioner says it's voluntary, it doesn't even penetrate. You're going to find out why it's voluntary in a minute. And what does self-assessment mean? Self-assessment means you assess yourself. And unless you assess yourself, you can't even owe the tax. Now, most people who pay property taxes know they get property tax. They don't assess themselves. The city sends an assessor down, determines your tax, and sends you a bill. Well, you know, you're going to discover, that's what the law says. If you owe an income tax, the government's supposed to send you a bill. And until they do that, you don't owe the tax. But again, how come you don't know this? Because your accountant and lawyer doesn't even bother to tell you. I want to ask you a question. How many people here, be truthful, how many people here filed a tax return last year? Come on, how many people filed a tax return last year? No, you didn't. You filed a confession. Well, think about it. If you can return a library book, you can return a lawnmower to your neighbor, but when I say return, what do you return to the government? You don't return anything. The word return first appeared in the tax literature in the Tax Act of 1862. And a return was a document prepared by government tax collectors returning to the government the documents that they were given to collect the tax and the money. And a return was a document prepared by government tax collectors. That's the way the word return may now make some sense. What you filed is a confession. Well, think about it. Don't you confess to how much money you believe you earned, what your deductions are, and you sign that confession under penalty of perjury. But suppose the government said, hey, it's April 15th, time to get in your confessions. The American public, hey, wait a minute, I can't be required to confess. And when you go to your accountants and lawyers, do they say, now, you sure you want to confess? No. Now, did you know how many people knew that all the information they put on their tax return could be used against them? Suppose your accountant said this to you when you filled out your tax return. Now, do you realize all this information the government can use against you? They can give it to foreign governments, they can give it to various government agencies, and they can use it against you. Is it okay with you if all this information is used against you? Is it okay with you? You would say no. Well, the government, we're going to get to that, the government tells you that right here in the 1040 booklet. They tell you, we may give the information to the Department of Justice and to other federal agencies provided by law, and we may give it to the cities, the states, the District of Columbia. But nobody reads this because it's buried in the Privacy Act. Nobody reads this because look what it says on top. Privacy Act and Paperwork Reduction Act notice. Everybody thinks when they see this, well, it has to do with saving government paperwork. And even if you read it, you wouldn't understand it anyway. But we're going to get to this. We're going to devote a segment. The point is, it's voluntary. And look, even when the government comes right out, I just showed you in the paper. Now, here is another article. This article was in USA Today, March 6, 1997. Here's the article. And in this article, USA Today was interviewing Senator Bob Kerrey, Democrat of Nebraska, who was co-chairman of the commission to restructure the IRS. And one of the objectives of the commission, presumably, was to ensure that the IRS collected taxes in a fair and reasonable manner. So the reporter asked Kerry, why does being fair and reasonable matter? And here's his answer. Because it's a voluntary system. If people don't perceive it to be fair, people will not voluntarily comply. We are struggling to maintain ground on voluntary compliance. Now, the word voluntary compliance, you'll see over and over again in a number of articles issued by the IRS in taxes. And the minute the people see voluntary compliance, they don't understand. Voluntary compliance means compliance is voluntary, but the public doesn't believe it. Actually, voluntary compliance is the classic oxymoron. It's a contradiction of terms. If something is voluntary, you don't have to comply. If you have to comply, it's not voluntary. So even though the public is told that the income tax over and over again is based on voluntary compliance, they never say, well, I don't want to volunteer. Now, what happened here, right on page 13 of the Federal Mafia, I actually reproduced the mission statement, which was the mission statement of the government for the last 20 years of the IRS, which they just changed, incidentally, because we've been using this so effectively against them. They wanted to take out voluntary compliance. But let me give you the mission of the IRS. The mission of the service is to encourage and achieve the highest possible degree of voluntary compliance with the tax laws. Well, if they're based on voluntary compliance, it means if you don't want to comply, you don't have to comply. If you were going down to the Department of Motor Vehicles, and you know that book that they give you when you study to pass, you know, besides the field driving test, there's this manual. You have to stop at a stoplight. You can only pass, you know, that little manual. Suppose in the front of that manual it said, these rules and regulations are based on voluntary compliance. What would that tell you? If Moses believed that the 10 Commandments were based on voluntary compliance, he would have named them the 10 Suggestions. The point is, there's no such thing as voluntary compliance. If something is voluntary, it's voluntary, and if you have to comply, you have to comply. The government attaches compliance to voluntary to hide. They don't want to come right out and say it's voluntary. However, sometimes they actually do that. Now, on page 12 of this book, Federal Mafia, I actually reproduced, you'll see, those of you who have your books, you can check it right along with me. On page 12, there is the annual report put out by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. At the time, Jerome Kurtz was then the commissioner. And you will see that in connection with the income tax, he says no less than 6 times that the payment of income tax is voluntary, voluntary, voluntary. Now, do you think that Jerome Kurtz doesn't know the meaning of the word voluntary? You can see on page 13, there's a training syllabus that the government would send to high schools. And you'll see where the arrows are. The term voluntary compliance. 3 times compliance is voluntary. Now, if you turn the page, as a matter of fact, on page 16, and you'll notice in the book, The Federal Mafia, I reproduced documents. One of the reasons why the book is a manual size, it allowed me to reproduce the actual documents. Because if I told you what was in the documents, you wouldn't believe what I would have told you. Because in figure 1.5, there is the actual transcript of the testimony being given by Dwight Avis, who was then head of the Alcohol and Tax Division of the IRS. And he's testifying in front of the committee. And look what he says. Your income tax is 100% voluntary, and your liquor tax is 100% enforced. Now, the situation is as different as day and night. So, here's document after document saying that the income tax is voluntary. My first book was called The Biggest Con, How the Government is Fleecing You. I approached the payment of income tax from an economic standpoint. I try to show how income tax would literally undermining America's industrial strength. The former Chief Justice, John Marshall, said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And the government is literally destroying productivity by taxing it. You know, the government wanted us to smoke less, so what they want to do, they want to put a tax on cigarettes so people won't smoke. Well, a tax on income is a tax on productivity, and if you tax productivity, you get less productivity, and therefore we have a lower standard of living. Before the income tax, which really went into force in 1943 with withholding taxes. But in 1939, Americans, women didn't work. All of our products, you went into a store, they were all made in America. America was the U.S. currency was regarded as the most reliable of all currencies. We were the world's mightiest creditor nation. Since we've had the income tax, we're now the world's biggest debtor. Very few products you will now find made in America in our store. The dollar has probably lost 95% of its value since 1939. This is what the income tax has done, because it follows John Marshall's observation that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and that's what the government's been doing to our standard of living, destroying it by the abusive imposition of the tax. So when I saw all of these documents, that payment is voluntary based on voluntary compliance, I don't want to pay income taxes, but I thought I had to by law. I was writing a book on taxation, shown from an economic standpoint, and I saw all these documents on voluntary compliance. So I called the IRS. I spoke and I said, is income tax based on voluntary compliance? And the man said, yes. And I said, well, I don't want to volunteer anymore. And he said, well, you have to volunteer. Now, I had just gotten out of the Army a few years before. They tell you, no, never volunteer. So I said, well, if it's voluntary, why do I have to volunteer? And he said, well, it's like stopping at a stoplight. This is what they tell you. If you stop at a stoplight, you do it voluntarily. If you go through, you get a ticket. I said, no. I don't stop at a stoplight voluntarily. I think if I don't stop and a cop sees me, I'm going to get a ticket. It's not voluntary. By that token, everything is murder's voluntary, because the government is not sending somebody alongside you to keep you from shooting somebody. Or how about selling drugs? Is that based on voluntary compliance? The FBI say that our drug laws are based on voluntary compliance? Why is it only the IRS says income tax are based on voluntary compliance? And if you ask your accountant or tax lawyer, well, isn't it based on voluntary compliance? They'll say yes. Well, it's voluntary in the sense that the government doesn't come down and make you fill out a tax return. And they always say, oh, in other words, filling out a tax return is compulsory and not voluntary. Is that right? Well, yeah. So every time the government says it's based on voluntary compliance, they really mean it's based on compulsory compliance? Is that what you're saying? Then why don't they just say it's based on compulsory compliance if it's compulsory? The word voluntary would have absolutely no meaning if it really wasn't voluntary. So here you have a nation of 100 million Americans actually believing that something is compulsory, even though the government tells them over and over again it's voluntary. Okay, now we're going to explain. Now here is a letter that I got from Congressman Dan Burton. I get more and more people to write to their congressman saying, what section of the law requires me to pay the tax, or what section of the law makes me liable. Remember the word liable, it's very important. So here's a letter from Dan Burton in which he actually tells a constituent that he could find no provision in the law that makes you liable. From a congressman. Here's a letter from John Ensign. He was on the House Ways and Means Committee. He was a congressman from Nevada, as a matter of fact. Let me read what he says. Let me start off by saying I cannot point to a specific place in the law where it says you must pay income taxes. Okay, what caused John Ensign ultimately to have to admit in a letter, which he was obviously reluctant to admit? As a matter of fact, the rest of his letter, he tries to confuse and blow smoke in your face by saying, why, we do have a voluntary tax system in the sense that the payment of income tax is optional. There are specific provisions of the law which require the payment of income tax. You see, that's double talk. Because if there was a specific provision of the law to pay the income tax, why didn't he identify it? So the rest of his letter is double talk, like most of the letters you get. Like Dan Burton's letter, the rest of the letter is double talk. He first answers the question and then tries to tell you why it's not significant. Okay, now what happened here is I took, let me see the date, in November 6, 1997. I took a half-page ad in the Las Vegas Review-Journal. It was an open letter to Harry Reid, Richard Bryan, John Ensign, and Jim Gibbons, who were the two congressmen. And I said, if they would have a town hall meeting, I would pay $50,000 to any charity of their choice if they could produce a statute making Americans liable for income tax or requiring them to pay it. And I would donate $50,000 to charity, and I would pay the cost of the town hall meeting. And we faxed these letters to their offices. Well, obviously, they couldn't produce any such statute. And at a town hall meeting that that John Ensign himself had scheduled about 2 weeks after the ad came on. He had a meeting, and at that meeting, at least there was 300 people at the meeting, and about 5 people reminded him of the ad and was pressing him to identify the law that required people to pay income taxes. He first said, well, you know, I'm not a lawyer, as if you got to be a lawyer to know whether you got to pay income taxes or not. And he had the services of the Congressional Research Service. But what's funny about it, there was a reporter from the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and there was no mention of that town hall meeting in the newspaper, because the reporter would have been forced to report him by the fact that John Ensign couldn't produce a law that required you to pay income taxes. And as a matter of fact, we had trouble even getting this letter after we reserved the space into the Las Vegas Review-Journal. As a matter of fact, when the Las Vegas Review-Journal accused me in an editorial of inviting people to break the law, we called and said, look, because I have a radio show, of course, in Las Vegas, and I said, look, just produce a law that requires people to pay income taxes, and I'll apologize, call in all my books, and I'll get off the ring and get a job at McDonald's. And I had more and more people calling the Las Vegas Review to produce the law, and finally they got so irritated, they said, look, you got to pay your income taxes, and that was their answer. But they couldn't produce the law. Okay, so, yeah. And this is one of the reasons, of course, why the American public doesn't know any of this. I just came back from, I was in Portland, Oregon, and I actually had a scheduled meeting with the reporter, the tax reporter at the Oregonian. And the day before the interview, he called to cancel the interview because apparently the head of the business department, and they didn't want that interview. I've actually been interviewed by newspapers thinking that a lot of this stuff I'm going to tell them is tax protest, kooky stuff, and they don't even report it. Sometimes they even deny I was ever there. So this is why the American public is really in the dark, because the traditional media, especially print media, doesn't want to print any of this stuff. Okay, so now, is there anybody here, after all of these documents, is anybody here who doesn't believe the payment of income tax is voluntary? I've given you government document after government document. We've shown you letters from congressmen. Now, the trick is, even though you know it's voluntary, that's not going to protect you. You have to develop procedures for protecting yourself from a crooked and criminal government. What's the title of my book?
The Federal Mafia.
The Federal Mafia. Now, anybody who reads my book and is familiar with this does not consider that title to be an exaggeration, because the back of my book, of course, says, a book that will convince you that organized crime in America begins with the federal government. The federal government has been literally extorting income tax from the American public, also running the world's biggest counterfeit ring, because all U.S. coin and currency is counterfeit. The Constitution requires it in gold and silver. And you're going to discover, unfortunately, Social Security is a chain letter. There are no trust funds, even though they claim there are trust funds. There are no trust funds. And, of course, the IRS runs the world's biggest fence. All articles seized by the IRS are stolen from the people because they weren't required to pay income taxes, so it's all stolen. And when they sell it, they're selling stolen articles. So the federal government runs the world's biggest fence. Okay. Now that you all agree that the income tax is voluntary, everybody agree? Okay. Now let me tell you why it's voluntary. For those of you, I'm going to explain why it's voluntary. And again, I know a lot of people are bewildered, because over and over again they're going to say, well, if it's voluntary, why do people go to jail? Why do people have their houses seized, bank accounts? How could 3 million Americans have their wages seized? Oh, incidentally, their wages were not seized. The IRS didn't go to their employers and seize it. The employers mailed those checks because they got a phony notice of levy, which we're going to talk about. But it's the lawyers for these firms that told these firms that they had to send these checks to the IRS. Lawyers. Now, before I even proceed, I want to tell you the most important aspect of the Constitution is what we call the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, which says you cannot be deprived of property except pursuant to due process of law. Now, due process means a hearing. Presumably, if you lived under Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, if Attila the Hun rode through a village over which he had control, presumably if he saw something belonging to a peasant, he could just grab it. Maybe even he couldn't, I don't know, but I assumed he could. What could the peasant do about it? Nothing. And gang or Attila the Hun. But presumably we're not living under Attila the Hun. Presumably the government can't see our property and grab it because of the due process clause of the Constitution. It says you can't be deprived of property without a hearing. Now, you know all those 3 million paychecks? There was no hearing, there was no court order. The government is, you might as well be living under Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan. And which is the Supreme Court, and we have law schools, and we have lawyers, and ask them, how can the government seize property without a court order or a hearing? And they're getting away with it, but they're having a more and more difficult time. As a matter of fact, the front page of the Wall Street Journal has been a couple of articles about the increasing numbers of people who are not paying income taxes, because they're discovering, indeed, it is voluntary, and they're following procedures that we've developed that enables them to stop paying income taxes without taking the risk that a number of us took years ago when we didn't file altogether. In any case, let me prove to you very quickly, if I haven't proved to you already, because right here on page 33 of the Federal Mafia, I have an excerpt from the Handbook for Special Agents. This is the IRS's own handbook, and I'm going to read from paragraph 342.12. It says, an individual taxpayer may refuse to exhibit his books and records for examination on the grounds that compelling him to do so would violate his right against self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment and constitute an illegal search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. So here is the IRS's own handbook saying that you cannot be compelled to turn over your books and records. When you do it, you're waiving your Fourth Amendment right. I have a Constitution. I published the Constitution. It's called the Tax Rebel's Guide. It's the only color-coded Constitution. And let me read you from the Fourth Amendment. Now, think of all the people who go down to IRS offices with their books and records. Sometimes they haven't come back for month after month. Bring your, if you say you have 3 dependents, sometimes if they want what they call a TCMP audit, they can ask you to bring down birth certificates, marriage licenses. They want to see all your documents, right? Let me read the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. The right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by our oath or affirmation. In other words, the government has no right to see your papers. If the government comes and they want to search your house, they can just come in and say, we want to look around, we think you've done something wrong, maybe you have some contraband, we want to look. No, in order to come into your house and get a search warrant, they're going to say, no, we think he has counterfeit money, we think he's keeping it here, we think he has a weapon. If they come in and just walk around, that's a fishing expedition. They have no right to walk around your house and see if you've done something wrong. Now, when the IRS audits you and they look at your books and records, they don't know you've done anything wrong, yet they want to see if what you reported on your tax return fits what your books and records are. Now, we're going to teach you how to file a zero return, how to pay no income taxes, and some